Welcome to Complete Anatomy. My name is Dr. Alan Detton, and in this lecture I'll be going over an introduction to the skeletal system. At the end of this lecture, you will be able to state the general functions of bone and cartilage within the skeletal system, list the bones comprising the axial and appendicular skeleton, recognize different types and classifications of bones and describe their general locations, describe typical features of a long bone, and list and define articular and non-articular bone markings. Introduction to the skeletal system. The skeletal system is designed to support soft tissue structures, and soft tissue structures could include the muscular system or potentially either the arterial or the venous systems. So these are all examples of soft tissue in our body that without the rigid skeleton for support simply wouldn't be able to maintain their position or play their key role in our body's function. Now, the skeletal system is also going to play a really important role in protecting some of the vital organs. And we're going to take a closer look at that as we look at the two different components of the skeletal system. The first is the bone. Now, bone is going to be responsible for the actual protection of the soft tissue structures in our body. Now, if I were to turn on the respiratory system, for example, you could see that our lungs are going to be protected within the skeleton of the thorax, as would be our heart if we were to turn on the arterial or venous system. So this is going to play a key role in keeping those vital organs of the heart and lungs well protected. Additionally, if we were to take a closer look at the head and use one of the tools to cut a window into one of the bones of the head, we could see that the skull is going to play a key role in protecting our brain. So these are what I mean by the vital structures or vital organs: the heart, the lungs, and the brain. Things to keep you alive, and if you didn't have the skeleton there, you wouldn't be able to protect those soft tissue structures. Now, the other function that we're going to see of the bone is going to be able to provide support for the muscles of the body, primarily the skeletal muscles of the body. And if we turn on the muscular system, you can see these different muscles, and you could hide them and turn them on or off to better understand their relationship with the skeleton. Additionally, you could actually turn on different layers or color maps for the skeleton to see the parts and the surfaces, as well as the sites of muscle attachment, which will give you a better idea of which muscles are going to attach at which locations throughout the body. Now, the other thing that we're going to see with the skeletal system, in particular the bones, is it's going to play a key role in storage of different minerals in our body like calcium and phosphorus, and it even plays a key role in production of red blood cells. And this is going to occur in the actual marrow of the bones, and we'll get into more detail about that later on as well. Now, the second component of the skeletal system is going to be cartilage. And cartilage is going to be a semi-rigid type of connective tissue that's quite resilient. However, it's going to still provide a lot of support while allowing a little bit more flexibility. And there are multiple types of different cartilage that we'll explore throughout this lecture. We're going to see that cartilage is going to line the ends of the long bones. It's going to act as a shock absorber between the different vertebrae in our body. It'll play a key role in the rib cage in allowing movement. And it's also going to be a component of our developmental process. And what we're going to see is that babies have a higher percentage of cartilage than adults. And this is because they're going to not only have smaller bones that have yet to fully develop, but they also have a component within the bones themselves known as growth plates. And these growth plates are going to be made of cartilage, and they'll be gradually replaced by bone as we age. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that cartilage differs from bone in that it is avascular tissue, meaning that it doesn't have a direct source of blood supply like many of the other structures in our body. There are three different types of cartilage found throughout our body: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Now, these different types of cartilage are going to have different characteristics and different functions. So let's begin by taking a closer look at the first of these types, which is the most abundant throughout our entire body and the most variable. And this is hyaline cartilage. Now, hyaline cartilage is going to be found in a lot of different locations. It's going to be found where our ribs meet up with our sternum, for example. So this forms the costal cartilage. So in this case, it's going to help protect the anterior aspect of our thoracic wall and thus protect our vital organs. We're also going to see that hyaline cartilage is going to line the ends of our long bones. So where one long bone meets up with another long bone, we're going to need a protective layer that is very smooth that reduces friction within the joints. We're also going to see that hyaline cartilage has some specializations within our head and neck. For example, this is the type of cartilage that builds up the end of your nose or the tip of your nose. So it's going to help keep the airways open and form the structural support for the distal extremity of your nose. We're also going to see hyaline cartilage within our throat, within the larynx, in the laryngeal cartilage, as well as the airway of the trachea. Lastly, we're going to see that hyaline cartilage is the precursor for bone. And what this means is that this is the layer that gets gradually replaced by bone within our growth plates. The next type of cartilage is far less variable and found in more specific locations. The name of this is fibrocartilage. Now, fibrocartilage is more dense than hyaline cartilage, it's less flexible, and it's going to be in a structural supportive type of role. So we can see an example of fibrocartilage here at an intervertebral disc. Now, intervertebral discs are actually going to be made up of two different layers: an outer fibrous ring that is made of fibrocartilage, and an inner nucleus pulposus, which is like a gelatinous bag to help act as a shock absorber. So just the outer aspect of this is made up of fibrocartilage. Now, what we're going to see is that fibrocartilage is also going to be found where bones need more support. So we will see this within the ligaments of our body that are attaching from one bone to another directly. We will see fibrocartilage also at the pubic symphysis, the point anteriorly where the right and the left hip bones meet. Fibrocartilage also surrounds and protects our joints by forming the joint capsules. Another key location to find fibrocartilage are at the cartilaginous pads between our bones of our knee. These are the menisci. So again, these are going to act like shock absorbers, similar to the intervertebral discs where we need more cushion and support for these weight-bearing bones within our body. Now, the last type of cartilage that we're going to see is the most limited in its organization throughout our body, and it's going to be the most flexible type of cartilage, as its name would imply. This is elastic cartilage. Now, elastic cartilage is going to form the auricular cartilage in our ears. So you could see an example of its mobility by grabbing the top of your ear and simply pulling it down, and it will bounce back up to its previous shape and its original appearance. We're also going to have epiglottis where we need a lot of movement, like we see here in the epiglottis, and some of the laryngeal cartilage. So this is an area that needs to be able to move to direct fluids and solids from the mouth down into the esophagus and away from the airway. So again, it needs to be able to bend frequently but maintain its original shape. Axial versus appendicular skeleton. There are two subdivisions for the bones within the human skeleton. These are going to be based on their location essentially and their relationship to the mid-sagittal or median plane. Now, if we were to take a look at the bones which are going to cross the mid-sagittal plane, we can see that these are going to be the bones that are going to primarily form the grouping that we are going to consider the axial skeleton. Now, the bones of the axial skeleton are going to consist of the bones that we find in the head and neck, as well as in the thoracic region, and continuing down into the lumbar and pelvic regions along the midline. The bones of the skull are going to help to serve two different functions. One, going to keep our airways open, and also they're going to help protect the brain. The cervical vertebrae, continuing down the vertebral column, are going to serve a key role in protection of vital organs and structures like our spinal cord, as well as a lot of the internal organs within the body. Now, the vital organs are also going to be protected by the thoracic region. So the bones here that we see in the thoracic region of the sternum and the ribs are going to serve a key role in protecting our lungs and our heart. So the axial skeleton is going to be this midline grouping of bones as well as the rib cage or thoracic cage. Now the other subdivision is going to be the appendicular skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton is going to be the rest of the bones in the human body. And what we can see here is these are going to be the bones that are forming the upper limb and the lower limb. So supportive roles in movement and control of how our body is positioned is primarily going to be the responsibility here of the appendicular skeleton. Now, we do have a lot of movement in our thorax. We can bend at the waist or the hip and position our body better. But a lot of that movement is going to be done out here in the periphery with this appendicular skeleton. The bones in the appendicular skeleton are going to be connected back to the axial skeleton by girdles. Up here by the shoulder, we can see that the clavicle and the scapula are going to be the two bones that are connecting the upper limb back to the axial skeleton. And thus, these two bones are going to be our shoulder girdle, also known as a pectoral girdle in some textbooks. Inferiorly, the bones of the lower limb are going to be connected back to the sacrum by our hip bones, otherwise known as the os coxae. So the os coxae, or the hip bones, are going to be key bones for weight transfer from the lower limb and provide a lot of stability for the movements that are required to help us be bipedal creatures. Types of bones. There are two different types of bones, which is going to be different than the classifications of bones. If I were to take a closer look at any single bone within the body, what I would see is it's going to be made up of the two different types of bones. And what I mean by that is better visualized if we were to take a cross-sectional piece out of one of these bones. And here we can see in this cross-sectional view, or the cut edge of that bone, the two different distinct appearances of the types of bone. Surrounding the edge of the bone is compact bone, also known as cortical bone, and this is made of a solid bony matrix. The solid bone is quite dense and strong and is primarily responsible for supporting the weight of our body. Now, compact bone also stores calcium, which is the principal molecule responsible for hardening this type of bone. The second type of bone is spongy bone, also known as cancellous or trabecular bone, and this is going to line the inner edge of that cortical or compact bone. Now, to better illustrate what this type of bone looks like, I'm going to bring in another image that is under higher power magnification. And here we can see the two different types of bone. Lining the outer edge of the bone is going to be the compact bone, while the spongy bone is going to line the inner aspect of that cortical bone, and it's going to surround an area known as the medullary cavity. Now, the medullary cavity is where we're going to find the bone marrow, and that's typically full of the spongy bone. Now, as we can see, there's a difference in appearance between this cortical or compact bone and the spongy bone. And one of the most noticeable differences is the difference in surface area between these types of bone. Now, if I were to remove this image and take a closer look at a bone after the disease process of osteoporosis. Now, osteoporosis is going to be gradual bone loss following a depletion typically of calcium within the bones. And this is going to start within that spongy region of the bone in most cases. So as we start to weaken the spongy bone, it's going to destabilize the cortical bone that surrounds it on its edge. So if an elderly individual were to fall down after having osteoporosis, it's quite common to see fractures present within the bone itself. And this is due to that destabilization of the skeletal matrix within the bone itself. There are multiple classifications of bones, which is different than the types of bone. Recall that the two types of bone were either compact or spongy bone. Now, these two types of bones are going to be found within all of the different classifications of bones. So let's first take a closer look at the easiest to identify classification of bone, and those are the long bones. Now, a long bone can be quickly recognized as it is longer than it is wide. These types of bones are going to have a long central portion, known as a shaft, and then two enlarged ends where it meets up with the other bones. Now, simply because of its overall length does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a long bone. However, the majority of the bones within the limbs are classified as long bones. What you may not be aware of is that the bones in our hands and feet are also considered long bones. Here we can see that the metacarpals and the phalanges follow the same pattern, where they're going to have a longer length than they are wide, and they're also going to have a central portion that is thin and long with two enlarged ends. The next type of bone that we should compare this to are short bones, which are approximately as wide as they are long. Now, these types of bones are the bones that we're going to find within our wrist, for example. So the carpal bones, these small bones within the wrist, are classified as short bones. So they're approximately going to be as long as they are wide, and they have mainly a supportive role. So these are the types of bones that support and stabilize our body with little movement. So they're going to be found at our wrist and our ankle in the carpal and tarsal bones. The next type of bone that we'll take a look at are flat bones. And a flat bone, as its name would imply, is going to be relatively flat. Now, they're still going to follow a similar pattern of having both compact and spongy bone, and they're arranged sort of like an Oreo cookie, where we're going to have compact bone, then spongy bone, then another layer of compact bone, which will help you with identifying their style or type. Now, these classifications of bones, the flat bones, are mainly going to be for protection. So they're the types of bones we see in our skull that protect our brain. They're also going to be the ribs, which are going to protect our thoracic organs, as well as the sternum. And then we can see some of the bones like our shoulder blade or aspects of our hip bones that have characteristics of these flat bones. Now, some bones don't fit in the classifications of long, short, or flat, so they are called irregular. And I can see two examples of irregular bones here. The hip bones have a very irregular shape. We're also going to see that the lumbar vertebra and all of the vertebra are going to have a very irregular shape when we compare that to other bones of the body. So these that have peculiar or complex anatomy are going to be considered part of the irregular bone classification. Now, the last type of classification that we're going to look at are the sesamoid bones. And sesamoid bones form within a tendon that crosses over an angle. And what we're going to see here is that the patella is a great example of this. This is a bone that forms within the quadriceps muscles that helps you flex and extend your knee. We're also going to have small sesamoid bones near the base of our thumb and at the base of our great toe. So these small bones here are also going to be considered sesamoid, that they form within a tendon. So remember the different classifications of bones as you study the bones of the human skeleton. When we look at the human skeleton, one of the bones that we most often think of are the long bones. These bones that are going to be found within our limbs that are longer than they are wide. And these bones are going to be found in the large components of our limbs like our thigh or our arm, but they're also going to be the smaller long bones that we find within our fingers or our hands and feet and toes. So just because it's not a certain length does not define it as a long bone. Rather, it's going to have characteristics that are continuous with this type of bone that is longer than it is wide. So let's take a closer look at one of these in particular and look at the different parts of this long bone. The main characteristic of these bones is that we're going to have a long central portion known as a diaphysis or a shaft that is going to be capped on either end by an enlargement of bone, the epiphyses. So we will have a proximal enlargement known as the proximal epiphysis and a distal enlargement known as the distal epiphysis. Now, in between these points of enlargements and the central shaft of the bone, we're going to have another component of the bone, and that is the metaphysis. And these are the locations within the long bones of where we had growth plates. So as a child or an adolescent, we're going to have cartilage forming a layer or a line within these long bones. And as we grow, there's going to be bone that lays down in the place of the cartilage and pushes the ends of the bone, the epiphyses, further away from one another. At a certain point in growing up, those growth plates are going to fuse. So the metaphysis is no longer going to contain cartilage, but will all be replaced by bone. And that is what's going to determine how long these bones get. Now you'll notice that at the ends of the epiphyses, we're going to have a smooth surface, both proximally and distally. This is known as the articular surface. So the articular surface is going to be the ends of the bone that get lined by hyaline cartilage, so that we're going to have a nice smooth area for reduced friction between bones at our joints. There are a few other key characteristics of the long bone that I'd like to take a look at by cutting a cross-sectional cut through the humerus. By doing so, we can see that there are going to actually be layers to this bone. So I want to just cover a couple characteristics of all bones, and those that are particular here with the long bones. To begin, the outer aspect of all of these bones is going to be lined by a layer of connective tissue that is known as periosteum. Now the periosteum is going to line the outer aspect of these bones. It's going to surround the tough, dense bone that provides the strength and support of these bones, which is the compact bone. And we can see here that the compact bone forms the outer edge of this cross-sectional cut. Deep to the compact bone, we're going to have the spongy or cancellous bone that will be immediately deep to the compact bone. And this is going to start to surround an internal space known as the medullary cavity, also known as the marrow cavity. So the marrow or medullary cavity is going to be the central portion of these bones, and it's going to be lined by a layer of specialized cells known as endosteum. And this will surround the hollow central portion of the bones, which is either going to contain fat and be yellow marrow, or red blood cells, which we would consider red marrow. So the bones are going to be developing either red blood cells or part of our lymphatic system and parts of our immune response within the medullary cavity. And the way that those cells get in and out of the bone are through small openings known as nutrient foramens. So especially in the shaft of a long bone, you're going to see small openings that would allow for the passage of blood vessels and nerves in and out of this space. Intro to skeletal terminology. Skeletal terminology is a list of words that are going to be descriptive for certain characteristics or components of anatomy that are only related to the skeletal system. For example, we're going to see that there are specific prominences or extensions of bone that are going to serve different purposes on the skeleton, and anatomists like to name things, and so we've given them all different names. Now, to help you understand what they are, I recommend you turn on the parts and surfaces of the different bones and look at these color maps as you explore through the app. Now, the first of these terms is a process. Now, a process is going to be an extension of bone, and there are multiple types of processes. We're going to see here on one bone, we have a transverse process, a spinous process, an inferior articular process, and a superior articular process. So these are going to be different extensions of bone, and some of them are going to be meant for sites of muscle attachment, while others are going to be aiming towards another bone and a point of articulation. Now, we're also going to see other names for extensions of bone, and one of them in particular is going to be given its name because of its sites of muscle attachment. And here we're going to see a tuberosity. And this tuberosity in particular is known as the radial tuberosity, and it gets its name for the bone that it's on, the radius. A different tuberosity is going to get its name for the muscle that attaches there, which is the deltoid tuberosity. So this is a roughened area of bone meant for muscle attachment as well. Now, we're also going to see other extensions of bone that vary in size and hence are going to get different names. For example, we're going to have a tubercle, or a small bump, that is going to be between our ribs and the vertebra. We're also going to have a tubercle that is a large bump out here on the humerus, and it gets the name greater tubercle or lesser tubercle, depending on its relative size to the other bump. Now, we're also going to get very large extensions or prominences of bone that are known as trochanters. So here on the femur, we're going to see a greater and a lesser trochanter. Now, not all of the bony landmarks are going to be for muscle attachment. For example, some of these are going to be depressions in the bone. We're going to see that the fossa is going to be a smooth depression within the bone. And if we were to look at the surfaces, we see this large area that is also going to be for a site of muscle attachment. And we could come up here to the scapula, and we're going to see that it also has different fossa or depressions where muscles will sit. Now, a foramen, on the other hand, is going to be an open area that does not have anything attaching at it necessarily. It might attach on the rim, but a foramen is going to be the actual hole through the bone. And these foramen are going to have different names based on their location and sometimes the contents that it allows to go through it. Now, we're also going to see that there are going to be terms related to grooves or depressions. So remember that we had a greater tubercle and a lesser tubercle. Well, in between those, there is a depression known as the intertubercular sulcus. So that's going to be named for the depression between those large bumps. And I know that this is a lot of new terms and words that you haven't heard before, so you're likely going to need to rewatch this a couple of times until you get them all down. The majority of the terms that we've looked at so far for skeletal terminology are related to points of muscle attachment. And now we're going to take a closer look at some of the bony landmarks that are either just generic or related specifically to where one bone meets another. The first of these is going to be related to a long bone, and the head is going to be one of the ends of that long bone. Now, the head of the long bone doesn't necessarily need to be at the proximal end. For example, we can see that some bones this is the case, like with the femur or the radius, which is going to have its head proximally, or even the humerus, which has its head proximally as well. However, the ulna is going to have its head located distally. So the head is simply going to be a rounded prominence or projection of that bone. Now, near the head is going to be the neck. So this makes some sense just based on your everyday terminology that we would find the neck below the head or in near proximity to it. Now, additionally, long bones are all going to have a central portion, otherwise known as the shaft. Now, on the ends of the bones where they meet one another, we're going to see that there is a smooth surface, and this is known as the articular surface. So the articular surface of the head of the femur is going to be the part of the bone that is actually going to meet up with the other structures in the area. So if you turn on the different parts and the surfaces of the bones, you're going to be able to see what those terms are. Now, the facet is going to be a specific type of articulation, and facet means face. And where we're going to find facet joints for the most part is where we're relating either to the ribs or to the vertebral column. So here we're going to have a superior articular facet. So it's given a very specific name to let us know it's on top, superior, articular, it's related to a joint, and it's a facet, the smooth part of that piece where they meet up. So a facet is going to be a specific type of smooth surface where you can see one bone overlapping with another here in the vertebral column. Now, a notch is going to be found in more particular places. Here we can see the ulna would wrap tightly around the humerus, and it would have a notch to fit around that component of the humerus where the two bones meet. Additionally, we're going to have certain bones that are going to have a condyle, which is going to be an extension of bone that is in specific locations on the opposite end of where the head was for certain bones. Recall that on the femur, the head was located proximally, so the condyle is going to be the opposite end of that bone. Now, some of these bones, like the humerus, are also going to have a very definite or pronounced projection known as an epicondyle, which means on top of the condyle. So again, the humerus is going to have a head at one end, a shaft, and then it's going to have condyloid type projections, which would have an epicondyle sitting on top of them. Now, there's a lot of different terms that you're going to learn as we go throughout this course, and I highly recommend taking the time to explore the skeleton and familiarize yourself with the different parts and surfaces, as well as these terms that I've just introduced.